It began as a routine renegotiation, but now it's spiraled into one of the most dramatic escalations in North American trade history. As of today, the United States has officially raised tariffs on Canadian goods from 25% to 35%, igniting a high-stakes confrontation with its second-largest trading partner. At the heart of the conflict is an August 1 deadline, imposed unilaterally by the White House, that has transformed technical trade talks into a geopolitical showdown. The Trump administration claims the move is justified on grounds ranging from Canada's supposed inaction on fentanyl trafficking to its recent recognition of Palestinian statehood, reasons that trade lawyers, economists, and diplomats alike have called politically charged and legally dubious. Regardless of the stated rationale, the economic implications are severe, and they are immediate. For Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the stakes could not be higher. Elected on a mandate of international competence and economic stewardship, he now finds himself navigating a compressed negotiation timeline with a U.S. president who shows little interest in conventional diplomacy. Behind the scenes, tensions have boiled over. Tariff threats have turned into executive orders, quiet lobbying has turned into public rebukes, and a relationship that once anchored a continent now hangs by a thread. This isn't just a Canada-US spot. It's a moment of reckoning for a global trade order increasingly defined by volatility, retaliation, and shifting alliances. And it's happening at a time when industrial systems, from steel to autos to food processing, are more interconnected and more vulnerable than ever before. To understand the scale of the crisis unfolding between Canada and the United States, one must begin with a hard look at their economic interdependence. Canada sends nearly 75% of all its exports to the US, a level unmatched by any other G7 country. This figure isn't just a statistic, it's the backbone of Canadian industrial economy. From autos manufactured in Ontario, to aluminum smelted in Quebec, to grain shipments flowing from the prairies, the Canadian economy is structurally tied to US demand. When that demand is suddenly subjected to double-digit tariffs, the shock is immediate and the vulnerabilities are laid bare. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, CUSMA, known in the US as USMCA, was supposed to shield this relationship. It guarantees tariff-free trade for roughly 90% of goods exchanged across North America. But what's outside that agreement, the remaining 10%, is now ground zero for economic warfare. These are the high-value, high-sensitive sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, energy, and agricultural staples. In other words, the arteries of modern industrial life.
But this isn't just about Canada. What we are witnessing is part of a much broader, deliberate recalibration of global trade policy led by the Trump administration. Over the past 3 months, Washington has imposed or raised tariffs not just on Canada, but on more than 40 other countries, with new duties ranging from 10% to as high as 40%, according to both the White House fact sheet and corroborated estimates from the International Monetary Fund. The logic, at least as articulated by the administration, is one of strategic decoupling, using tariffs as a tool not merely to correct trade imbalances, but to exert pressure in areas far beyond the bounds of traditional economic negotiation: national security, geopolitical alignment, even drug policy. This has created a global ripple effect. Manufacturing hubs in Europe and Asia are scrambling to reroute supply chains. U.S. multinationals are reevaluating cost models, and Canada, caught in the crossfire, finds itself at a crossroads: either double down on the U.S. market and absorb the costs, or pivot fast toward a more diversified, self-reliant trade posture. Neither option is simple, but in this moment, neither is optional. The shockwaves of the tariff escalation are not abstract. They are sectoral, immediate, and visible across factory floors, grocery aisles, and dealership lots. Nowhere is this more pronounced than in Canada's steel and aluminum industries. These sectors, once tightly integrated with American manufacturers through long-standing contracts and cross-border logistics, have been blindsided by a tariff hike that now stands at a staggering 50%. According to the Canadian Steel Producers Association, domestic output has already fallen by 30% since the first wave of U.S. tariffs hit in March. For an industry that operates on thin margins and long planning cycles, this isn't just a temporary disruption, it's an existential blow. The consequences are ricocheting back into the U.S. economy itself. Ford Motor Company, headquartered in Dearborn, Michigan, reported $800 million in tariff-related losses in just one fiscal quarter. A significant portion of that cost was attributed to the soaring price of military-grade aluminum used in its flagship F-150 pickup trucks, aluminum sourced from Quebec. This is a prime example of how cross-border production networks, built over decades for efficiency and scale, are now being punished by blunt force economic policy. The automotive sector has arguably become the emblem of this cascading damage. Canada's auto exports have fallen to levels not seen since late 2022, a direct result of Trump's 25% tariff on vehicles and auto parts. And the problem goes beyond export figures. Modern vehicle manufacturing is a choreography of just-in-time logistics. A single car assembled in Ontario may cross the US-Canada-Mexico border up to 8 times before completion. Now, each of those crossings risks additional cost, delay, or outright rejection. Manufacturers, facing an unpredictable policy environment, have started slashing production lines in anticipation of lower demand and higher input costs.
The effect on pricing is already being felt by consumers. Statistics Canada reports a 5% year-over-year increase in the cost of new vehicles, with used car prices also surging by more than 7%. Analysts suggest that as buyers get priced out of the new vehicle market, they are clinging to older cars longer, delaying purchases, postponing upgrades, and straining maintenance infrastructure. In grocery stores, the impacts are subtler but equally significant. Canada's counter tariffs have hit a range of U.S.-sourced food items, including peanut butter, canned soups, pasta, citrus juices, and ketchup. These aren't luxury goods, they're pantry staples, consumed by millions of households. The country's largest grocer, Loblaw, has begun tagging products affected by tariffs with a small T label to inform shoppers of the price increase. As of last month, more than 7,500 items on their shelves carried the mark. The impact on consumer behavior has been immediate. Loblaw reports a 20% decline in sales for tariff-labeled goods, a dramatic indicator of price sensitivity in a fragile post-inflation economy. Behind these statistics are real operational challenges. Many Canadian food processors source packaging materials, like soup cans or aluminum lids, from the U.S. Because of tariff-induced metal costs, canned goods have become more expensive to produce, even when the contents are domestic. Fruit juice prices, for example, have risen 7.5% in just 1 year, and canned soups are up by 8%. And while some sectors, like dairy, remain shielded under Canada's domestic quota system, others are being forced to make rapid, sometimes unsustainable adjustments to survive the new cost landscape. What's unfolding is not simply a bilateral trade dispute. It's a full-spectrum disruption across some of the most essential and politically sensitive segments of the Canadian economy. From industrial metals to family groceries, no sector that touches the U.S. border is insulated. The true power of tariffs lies not just in their immediate economic bite, but in the way they cascade through entire systems, supply chains, regional labor markets, consumer behavior, and national investment strategies. What begins as a border tax on steel or auto parts doesn't stay confined to spreadsheets or customs declarations. It radiates through multiple sectors, transforming pricing structures, delaying projects, and forcing difficult decisions at every rung of the industrial ladder. Nowhere is this more evident than in Canada's construction and housing sector. Materials like structural steel, layered glass, and HVAC components, many of which are imported or reliant on cross-border inputs, have all risen sharply in cost since the tariffs were imposed. This isn't just anecdotal, it's measurable. According to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, provinces like Ontario are already witnessing a significant decline in new housing starts, with some regions reporting an 8 to 26% drop compared to pre-tariff baselines. Developers, unsure of future input costs or delivery timelines, are either pausing projects midstream or pivoting to less material-intensive builds. In some cases, they are simply walking away. The uncertainty alone has been enough to freeze portions of an industry that was already under pressure from interest rate hikes and inflation.
That same ripple effect is showing up on the retail floor. Household appliances, washing machines, dryers, refrigerators, are now noticeably more expensive. The tariffs have compounded a surge in the cost of sheet steel, one of the core materials used in appliance manufacturing. Canadian consumers are paying between 2 and 4.5% more on average, with the price increases disproportionately hitting middle-income households, furnishing new homes or replacing old units. Retailers, trying to soften the blow and move inventory, have begun running pre-tariff sales, a tactic that underscores just how embedded the trade conflict has become in the consumer marketplace. It's no longer a matter of international policy, it's on the showroom floor. Clothing and footwear, though seemingly unrelated to metal tariffs, have not been spared either. For 2 decades, Canadians benefited from a steady decline in apparel prices, largely driven by the emergence of low-cost manufacturing hubs in Southeast Asia. But as global uncertainty rises, and as countries like Vietnam and China become entangled in separate waves of U.S. tariffs, the shockwaves are making their way back to Canadian shelves. Prices for clothing have risen by 2% year over year, not a dramatic surge, but one that breaks with a long-standing deflationary trend. In an industry that has historically relied on stability, price signals like this are warning signs of deeper structural frictions. For importers and wholesalers, the message is clear: volatility is the new baseline. These disruptions are not isolated, they're systemic. Tariffs applied to raw materials or semi-finished goods ricochet through procurement departments, production schedules, and distribution networks. They distort price discovery, force renegotiations of long-term contracts, and erode trust in the predictability of cross-border commerce. And because the sectors being hit, construction, housing, consumer goods, are foundational to everyday life, the pain is not abstract. It's baked into mortgage decisions, purchase delays, and budget cuts in real time. This is what makes tariff escalation uniquely destabilizing. It functions like a slow-moving economic contagion, infecting systems far beyond its initial point of contact. While consumers and manufacturers wrestle with rising costs and delayed timelines, financial institutions and policy analysts are beginning to chart the longer-term macroeconomic picture. The Royal Bank of Canada, in its June forecast, acknowledged that roughly 90% of goods traded between Canada and the U.S. remain shielded under the USMCA agreement. But even with that insulation, the bank warned of a brewing risk to broader macroeconomic stability if tensions persist, pointing in particular to supply chain distortion, business uncertainty, and investor hesitation in trade-sensitive sectors. TD Bank has echoed those concerns, noting that Canadian exports are already underperforming in tariff-targeted sectors such as autos and steel. Their data suggests that while energy exports remain resilient, the pain is mounting in high-value industrial goods, with automakers slashing production and steel facilities operating well below capacity.
Even U.S. data reinforces this trend. According to figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, American manufacturers are now facing steeper input costs. Ford has already cited hundreds of millions of dollars in tariff-related expenses in a single quarter, while Alcoa, which runs multiple smelters in Quebec, is lobbying for carve-outs, pointing to the deep interdependence between U.S. and Canadian metal supply chains. The numbers tell a simple story. This isn't a trade war Canada can lose without America also paying a price. Prime Minister Mark Carney has responded with a mix of economic defense and industrial realignment. On the fiscal side, his government has announced a $1 billion allocation through the Strategic Innovation Fund to support modernization and R&D in Canada's steel industry. The message is clear: Canada intends to build more, build smarter, and become less reliant on volatile foreign suppliers. New tariff rate quotas are now being imposed. Imports from non-FTA countries will be cut to half their 2024 volumes, with anything beyond that threshold taxed at 50%. And to prevent circumvention, an additional 25% levy will be slapped on steel imports that include material melted and poured in China, regardless of the country of origin. Government procurement rules are also shifting. Major national infrastructure projects, housing programs, and even defense contracts will now be required to prioritize Canadian steel. This isn't just a symbolic move, it's a structural pivot toward domestic resilience. Carney's broader strategy, summed up in his words, is to make Canadians their own best customer, redirecting demand inward while diversifying export markets outward. What we're witnessing isn't just a dispute over tariff lines or trade deficits. It's a clash between globalization's past and the political economy of the present. The US-Canada trade conflict now touches everything from national security to diplomatic recognition, from aluminum trucks to tomato ketchup.
And while it's tempting to view this as temporary political theater, the deeper truth is that supply chains are being redrawn, industries are adapting in real time, and nations are being forced to rethink who they depend on and why. For Canada, the path forward isn't easy, but it may be necessary. In a world where economic stability is no longer guaranteed by alliances or agreements, resilience, industrial, strategic, and political, has become the new currency of survival.